I thought you'd think about this and come to a different conclusion.
The Rules Committee will come to order, and I'm very pleased to have two of my favorite people in Congress who, just a personal privilege moment, do some of the hardest work, and mostly in a bipartisan way. If we could have Perlmutter to sit down, we could get on with the business here. But anyway, Kay and Nita, yeah, they'll be here.
We call it a fair fight.
Yeah. I like that. So anyway, Kay and Nita, thank you all so much for what you do for all of us. Congress must act by the end of the day Thursday to prevent a government shutdown, and I feel that this majority is leading the way. Now, let me remind everyone that the House passed bills to fund 96% of the government earlier this year, but delays in the Senate means Congress needs more time to finalize its appropriations measures. That's why this committee is considering a continuing resolution that will fund the government through December 20th. It keeps vital programs authorized and funded while fully funding a fair and accurate 2020 census and giving our military a 3.1% pay raise. There's nothing extremely controversial here, not especially partisan provisions. It simply keeps the lights on for another month while negotiations on a longer-term deal continue. It's something I hope that Democrats and Republicans can agree on, and no one should want another costly and unnecessary government shutdown. Now let me turn to our ranking member and my good friend, Mr. Cole, for any remarks he wishes to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to start off first by saying when I see my two favorite members, my two bosses on the Appropriation Committee here, I know something good is going to happen. So I'm delighted to see them both here. And I'd be remiss not to take a moment, Mr. Chairman, to just inform the community, or the committee, that Saturday night in Waco, Texas, the greatest football comeback in OU history occurred, where we, the undefeated Baylor Bears had a 25-point lead. We won the game 34-31. Somebody went back and looked at looked at all the games where a ranked team with a 25-point lead at home had lost. It had happened only one previous time in over 900 occasions. So we're pretty good.
Is that some kind of symbolism about what's
well, I thought I'd start off with two good pieces of news. First, our two top appropriators here. That's always good news. And second, when the University of Oklahoma has the largest comeback in the greatest program's history, that's pretty remarkable too. So feeling pretty optimistic. But today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, rises on very short notice as we consider the latest continuing resolution to fund the government and keep it open until December 20th of this year. I will certainly be supporting the underlying bill when it comes to the floor this week. Simply put, there can be no excuse for shutting down the government. This bill will prevent that from happening and will ensure that the government remains open and operating and continue to provide essential government services that our constituents deserve and count on. That said, today's hearing is another reminder that this Congress is not getting its work done. And as you point out, that's not just on one side of the rotunda. To date, we've yet to pass a single one of our 12 spending bills into law. Last Congress, during an election year, we still managed to get bills covering 80% of the full year spending passed into law by the start of the fiscal year. That we have yet to get even one such bill passed into law yet shows that this Congress's priorities have not been where they need to be. This is, in a word, disappointing. We're almost 2 months of the way through fiscal year 2020, and while the majority dithers on other distractors, we failed to move forward with our work on appropriations. I strongly recommend that we refocus our attention on this topic. The American people sent us here to do our jobs, and we won't have the job done until we pass all 12 appropriations bills for 2020. I know that's the goal of our two witnesses today, and frankly, I have every confidence that they will achieve that goal if others will work with them in the same manner that they work with one another and have throughout their careers, whether one of them was in the majority or the minority. They've traded hats on that a number of times over the years. I've never seen them fail to get the job done. I think if our friends in the Senate will cooperate with them, we will get the job done yet again. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, and we're prepared now for the testimony on further Continuing Appropriations Act 2020 and further Health Extenders Act of 2019. Welcome the witnesses, and we're delighted, as I've expressed, that you all are here, and anything you brought in writing will, without objection, be entered into the record. I now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Chairwoman Lloyd.
And I thank the chair, Chairman Hastings, and the ranking member, Mr. Cole. It's always a pleasure and nice to be with all of you and to see some of our new members on this committee. It is a pleasure. I do appreciate the opportunity to come before the Rules Committee to discuss House Democrats' continuing resolution to keep government open as we work to complete an orderly appropriations process. While the House did its work and passed 12 appropriations bills through committee and 10 appropriation bills off the floor, delays in the Senate mean the appropriations process is behind. With just days until current stopgap funding expires, we must pass a continuing resolution to keep government open and fund key priorities as we negotiate subcommittee allocations and then finalize individual appropriations bills. This legislation avoids controversial policies and instead contains provisions that reflect shared priorities, including bipartisan language to fully fund a fair and accurate 2020 decennial census, a 3.1% pay raise for our military, and language to prevent a rescission of $7.6 billion in highway funding. In addition to these provisions, the CR includes a package of extenders that will keep health programs critical to American families up and running. By extending these programs and government funding through December 20th, this CR will allow additional time to negotiate and enact responsible long-term funding for priorities that make our country safer and stronger and give working families a better chance at a better life. Mr. Chairman, I request an appropriate rule to bring this legislation to the floor.
All right. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify on the continuing resolution. We all know in this room how important that is and how much work's been put into it. Unfortunately, the text of the CR was just released literally minutes ago, so I have not had the chance to review it, but I'm hopeful I can support it. I certainly support moving in this direction now. I don't think anyone in this room that understands what a shutdown could be would want that. The continuing resolution would avoid that, and that's why we must do it. It must be passed now. I hope what I'm going to read is something that we all can pass. Had we have a shutdown or a long-term CR, it would be devastating to our military, and many of our military leaders have stepped forward and talked about how devastating that would be and what would be lost. I know that Mrs. Lowy and Senator Shelby have been trying to finish allocations. I hope they can do this quickly. I look forward to working with my colleagues to finish this year's appropriation process, and certainly with Mrs. Lowy, who I've worked with before and respect so much. We need bipartisan appropriations bills that the President can sign into law. And I thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I yield back.
All right, thank you, Ms. Granger, and I now turn to Ms. Torres for any questions she may have.
I don't have a question. I just want to thank both of you for coming before our committee today. And I know how committed you both are to this work. I am disappointed, again, that we're here with the CR, but I support it, and I hope that both of you will continue to work together to ensure we get a funding bill that will not shut down our federal government. So thank you for that commitment, and I yield back.
Ranking Member Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question, and it may be too delicate for you to answer, and I certainly would respect that. But I know one of the outstanding issues has been the allocations other than defense, which was agreed upon in the budget agreement in July. So we have 11 other bills, though, and I know there's some differences. Could either of you shed any light? Do you see progress there? Are we pretty close on knowing what the other bills are? Because, as you know, almost impossible for us to negotiate till we have agreed upon set of numbers for all the subcommittees.
Well, I would just like to say that I'm very pleased that there is progress being made. I do hope on the other side, in the Senate, we can see progress as well. So I'm looking forward to completing our work, which is our responsibility, and there's no reason that agreeable people such as my ranking member and I can work together with all those on both sides of the aisle and get our work done. So progress is being made. Thank you for your question.
Absolutely. Just, do you feel comfortable, and again, this is addressed to both of you, comfortable that we can get those allocations in time to then hopefully finish all 12 bills by that December 20th deadline? So we literally could go home for Christmas with the appropriations work for fiscal year 2020 done.
Well, I will say, having served in this House for quite a few years, I'm not quite comfortable at any point where additional deliberations have to take place, but I feel very good that progress is being made and we'll be able to complete our work.
I would say that it was important that we have this continuing resolution, this short-term continuing resolution right now, because that allows for a December 20th deadline to pass the full continuing resolution to that time. I'm disappointed that we don't have it tonight, but I understand it really actually did come within minutes ago. When we look at it, I hope there's not so many new things that we will be delayed in having a vote this week.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks. Just thank you, too, for getting us to this point. I just had a quick question on Section 1703 on extending provisions of FISA. So everything else is extended, looks to me like, to December 20th. FISA, we've got to March 15th of 2020. Just curious what the sections are and why we're taking it to March.
Well, the CR, as you know, extends these three provisions through March 15th, 2020. Just to review, in case there are any other questions, we're talking about the Section 215 of the U.S. Patriot Act, which authorizes the FBI to collect certain business records, the roving wiretap provision, which allows the government to track suspects across devices and jurisdictions, and the lone wolf provision, which authorizes surveillance of certain non-U.S. persons, even if the government cannot show a link to specific foreign power. These are set to expire on December 15th, and we just thought the best way to deal with these, because they're so important, is extending these provisions through March 15th.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask the ranking member, since she mentioned the devastating impact of long-term CRs on the military. It was 2 months. Now we're almost a quarter of the year. I know the definition of long-term changes, but you talk to folks in the field so much more often than I do. What's our window? When is that closing on being able to salvage what you all began together as one of the most successful appropriations years in my time in Congress. And now we find ourselves where we are today.
It really is, it's really disappointing because as we work through that, we really hope to set a bar and say, this is what we should be doing. We should pass our bills, we should pass them on time, we should come to an agreement through all that we go through, and it's not happening right now. And so I'm very disturbed about it. I met with a very high ranking, couldn't really be more high ranking than the person that I spoke to, and he said, you can never buy back time. So every time we move this, we lose time. And that's, in the military particularly, there's a huge danger. And that's what's happening. So I hope that what I see is something that I can come back and say, yes, this is what we agreed to. But that's the thing, you can't buy back time. Beyond just what it does to our people in uniform, when we do these and we move them and we change them, I had a group came to me and talked to me about the defense contractors, and they have an agreement, this is what we're going to do, and they have people that they've hired to do that. And so when we start changing that, moving that, we lose relativity to those contractors of, we said do this, and we're trying to do it, and now you change the rules. The same thing with their employees, that they are planning on, this is something new, we're going to hire employees for that, they've got them in line, and if we don't act then, they can't offer them those jobs.
I've been talking up here in the Rules Committee about some of the bad habits that we're getting in and how hard it is to change those bad habits, which you all did, again, extraordinary in one of the most successful appropriations years in a decade. I can't imagine 15 years ago the House could have done as much work as the House did, and the Senate would have just done nothing then. But we've gotten into that habit that the expectation is that nothing will happen, and I know we can't get out of that habit without the leaders like the two of you, and I'm grateful to you for the example that you have set.
I just want to add, because I know we are in agreement, that honoring the service and sacrifice of the men and women in uniform should be reason enough for every person to vote for this bill.
There. That's well said. I've got a Joe Wilson bill I want to talk to you about, too, that we've been talking about up here in this committee, but I couldn't agree with the chairwoman more. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to thank both of you for your testimony. Madam Chair, here in Congress, the idea of a continuing resolution is almost second nature to us, but I still think there are a lot of people in America who don't understand what it is, and I wonder if you would just explain what a continuing resolution is and why we need one at this particular moment.
Well, frankly, it is absolutely essential that we get our work done. And all those who were here, at the Rules Committee, and anybody else who is listening, we cannot shut government down. We know what has happened. I don't want to review the past. I don't want to talk about whose fault it is. The important thing is we have to fund government. And if we have not completed our work, and we could ask me many questions, and I'd be happy to answer as to why it hasn't been done on time. But today, I feel it's just important to have a CR, continue our discussion, and if there are any issues that are still outstanding where there may be disagreement between Dems and Republicans or anywhere in between, it's important to continue our work so we don't shut the government down.
And am I right that unless it's otherwise specified in the continuing resolution authorization, that the government remains open on the prior budgetary terms that have already been approved?
Unless it's specific language here.
To the contrary, yeah.
Correct.
Okay, that's all I've got, Mr.
Thank
Chair.
you for your thoughtful question.
All right. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Granger, you said that this is a question if you can't buy back time. And I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I find it very frustrating that we've squandered so much time in this Congress when we knew what was ahead of us. So the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, we passed a continuing resolution. We knew that that would expire. That's an IOU. It's got a drop dead date of November 20th. We all agreed that we don't want to see an appropriations lapse and see people's employment put in jeopardy. So hard to understand and hard to justify why, when that extension was asked for and granted, that we wouldn't have invested the time to make that work. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what we spent time doing in this Congress, but it wasn't the work that we're required to be doing. So, month of October, we took a 2-week break, and then we came back to have secret hearings down in the SCIF, and then we took another week break, and then we came back for some public hearings. I don't get it. And I think when people look at this and what is the work product that this Congress has been able to produce, it's pretty indefensible. Now, I don't think there's any question that this continuing resolution needs to pass. I don't kid myself that another 4 weeks is going to make a significant amount of difference, because I know how we're going to spend a good portion of that 4 weeks, and I think it's appalling that we would spend our time that way. But still, here we are. And you know, it's not even a question of just blaming it on the other body. I get it. The House passed appropriations bills. I didn't like the way they were constructed. You all are in the majority. You have the votes, but you also have an obligation to recognize that you're going to work with the other body and get something done. But when I look at Division B of Title I, community health centers, National Health Service Corps, teaching health centers, Indian Health Service, special diabetes programs, these actually aren't appropriations. These are authorizations. Mm-hmm. These are authorizations that really the House hasn't done, and the House could do, and the House should do, if they weren't spending so much time doing something else. So, look, in the last Congress, I was chairman of the Health Subcommittee on Energy and Commerce. We had a lot of authorizations. We had more authorizations than are required this Congress. We had more authorizations, reauthorizations last Congress. We had the FDA, children's health insurance. In addition to the community health centers and the Indian Health Service and the special diabetes programs, we got those all done. So it's hard to get to the appropriations work if we're not even doing the authorization work. And we're not doing the authorization work because, again, there's something that we're spending our time doing that is anything but the authorization. And look, I've asked for our subcommittee to, part of our job is to look at some of the work that we've already done, and is it being done correctly as it goes to the agency? The big one in my tenure has been the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act that repealed the sustainable growth rate. We don't find ourselves at the end of every calendar year having to come up with a doc fix because we repealed the SGR. But there's some things that require us to look and reassess. But again, we can't do that because we're spending our time doing anything but that work. So I would just make a plea that we stop doing the things that are never going to make a difference in the trajectory of this country. They're never going to do anything to help the economy. And let's work on those things that should be worked on. And Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask unanimous consent to place into the record a letter that was written in early June of this year that talked about some of the changes that are necessary in the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act, some of the flexibility that our doctors need in order to be able to provide Medicare services to our patients. We're in that interval where there is going to be no positive update for several years under the terms of MACRA. I think we ought to revisit that, and a positive
Without
update is
objection.
something we should consider, but I do want to make this letter available.
Without objection.
Again, there's work we should be doing. There is work that is going on right now that doesn't help anybody. And we need to get on with the work that actually helps the people we were sent here to help. And I appreciate everyone listening, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess, I would remind you that we have passed measures that went to the United States Senate. As a matter of fact, the number is 401 measures that are sitting on the desk of the Senate Majority Leader. The fact of the matter is, some of them are road names and post office names, but if you wanted me to, I could pull up the substantive matters that have been passed. We've been chewing gum and walking
Well, would the
at the
gentleman-
same time. Sure. I'll
Would the
yield.
gentleman yield? Division B of this continuing resolution that is in front of us today isn't so much about the appropriations. We haven't authorized this spending.
Agreed.
We should be doing that work, and it would be easier to make the case that it's an appropriations problem if we would do our authorization work.
Right. I suggest to you that by December 20th, Ms. Lowy, Ms. Granger, Mr. Shelby, and others recognize their responsibilities, and I believe that much of what you're talking about will be done. I might add, let's don't discount the fact that other work, I guess, is the elephant in the room that you're talking about is the ongoing impeachment inquiry, which many of us perceive as vitally necessary to carry out our constitutional responsibilities. Ms. Scanlon?
Thank you for being here, and thank you for all of your efforts. I've only been here a year, but I've lived through one shutdown, and I hope never to do that again. I am really, really encouraged by the inclusion of the funding for the census. 23% of my constituents are at risk of not being counted. We know in Pennsylvania that's worth about $2,000 per person, and we really, really need those resources to be able to provide roads and schools and hospitals and everything for my district. So thank you for making that part of this bill, and I look forward to supporting it. Thank you.
Ms. Lesko?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually have a question for Chairman Lowy, and it's on page 15 of the bill. It has to do with the United States Victims of State-Sponsored Terrorism Fund Clarification Act. And we had passed a bill that was actually signed into law in July of this year to help the 9/11 victims, which I supported. So how is this different, and why do we need another fund for the 9/11 victims? Because it says it splits 50/50 funding.
Dealt with healthcare, and this is about different benefits.
It's a different benefit. We've just been briefed on it recently, but it's a different benefit. This has to do with health care.
The previous one was
Yeah.
health.
Well, I'll give you some more.
Okay.
The new language would clarify eligibility for and implementation of the United States Victims of State Sponsors of Terrorist Fund as enacted in fiscal year 2015, governed by regulations from Special Master Feinberg. Changes would correct disparate treatment of 9/11 victims, widows, and dependents by making them eligible to make claims against state sponsors of terrorism, such as Iran, even if they had already applied or received compensation from the Victim Compensation Fund established for 9/11 widows and orphans. This language satisfies concerns by the immediate families and dependents of 9/11 victims that they should be eligible for payments. It should also ensure that the funding will be fairly shared between such immediate and more distant family members, as well as between 9/11 and non-9/11 victims and their families.
Can I
Thank you,
add?
yes.
I met with a number of those victims and their families, and what was passed some years ago, we forget how long this has been, and was changed as the money was paid out. Some families were split. In other words, this widow lived through it, but a distant cousin also did and was getting money. So it has been approached since that decision unfairly. We're trying to make it fair again for those who are still living.
And thank you. And do either of you, maybe, because I just got this and I know what we passed a bill this year. Was that just for medical expenses, for the 9/11 victims, and this is another pot of money? I'm trying to understand the difference. Does anyone know?
It was for the 9/11 healthcare responders. It was from the responders, and that was them, not the victim, not the families of the victims.
Okay.
Well,
Yes.
as I understand it, and I said this before, I don't have additional information. The
Yeah.
language does satisfy the concerns by the immediate families and dependents of 9/11, that they should be eligible for payments. And it should ensure that the funding will be fairly shared between such immediate, more distant family members, as well as between 9/11 and non-9/11 victims and their families.
Yeah,
That's what I
and so I had I misremembered, and so thanks for the clarification. The one that was passed in July was for the first responders. This is for the victims. That's the
Right,
difference. Thank you.
right.
Mr. Morelli? Good, sir. Ms. Shalala? Mr. DeSaulnier? All right. Thank you all. At this time, does any other member of the committee wish to ask a question? Yes, Mr. Cole.
Mr. Chairman, I would just ask unanimous consent to place in the record a statement from Mr. Womack on an amendment that he had asked.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Seeing no other, or hearing no other questions, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. And as I indicated earlier, if you have anything for the record, please leave it with the stenographer. And you are now free to go. Thank you all. Are there any other members who wish to testify on the further Continuing Appropriations Act? Seeing or hearing none, this closes the hearing on that measure. At this time, the chair is going to entertain a motion from the distinguished woman from California, my friend, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant a rule providing for the consideration of the Senate amendment to H.R. 3055, the Commerce, Justice, Science, Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration, Interior, Environment, Transportation, and Housing and Urban Development Appropriation Act 2020. The rule makes in order a motion offered by the chair of the Committee on Appropriations or her designee that the House concur in the Senate amendment with an amendment inserting the text of Rules Committee Print 116-38 in lieu of the matter proposed to be inserted by the Senate. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the motion. The rule provides that the Senate amendment and the motion shall be considered as read. Finally, the rule provides 1 hour debate on the motion equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations.
All right, you've heard the motion from the gentlewoman from California. Is there any amendment or discussion? Hearing no further discussion, the question is now on the motion offered by the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. All right, the gentleman has not asked for a recorded vote, and accordingly, the chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. McGovern, is going to manage for the majority. All right, without objection, the committee is adjourned, and if you all keep me as the chair, we'll get this stuff done in a hurry.
Is this a coup?